You have coffee, right?
Okay, so hi everybody. This is of course the DM60 class. We're going to talk about box model, the CSS box model, floats and positioning techniques. This will be the beginning of positioning techniques. We'll be talking about positioning and layout for a few weeks. The website that lists the next exercise, I'm changing that. I'm rearranging some stuff and integrating some stuff from some other classes that I used to teach. So the classes and IDs part of the exercise for next week we already covered, so I'm going to modify that. So don't work ahead on next week's yet, because that will change. I'll take the one that's listed for the 10th exercise. I'll make that the 9th one. So if you want to look at the 10th one, that will be the next exercise. But it's listed as exercise 10, not 9. And we're going to do exercise 8 today. So hope you're all safe and sheltering at home. And so let me outline a few things. So cascading style sheets has 3 different versions. There's level 1, level 2, and level 3. And level 3 is in various stages of development based on which module of level 3 of CSS you're talking about. So there's many different techniques of CSS level 3, some of which are more mature than others in terms of the technical specifications. We're going to be talking about floats today and the box model, and so we're not getting into anything too dramatic yet, which we will get into CSS level 3 stuff, which is some layout techniques using grids next week. So we're going to do some very rudimentary layout things, but the exercise is mostly about the box model and floats. The CSS box model is like the ABCs of positioning. It's very basic. It really defines how much space is around each object, and the space around an object determines a lot of how things flow around it. And then floats are very old cascading style sheets. It's one of the original ways you could move stuff around on the page was using what they call floats. And floats are handy, and they're pretty easy to wrap your brain around. So compared to some of the other positioning techniques. So any questions from previous material? Hey, whose room is that? Oh, Leslie, nice room. Wow. First I thought it was a picture. Is that really your room or is that a picture?
It's from an animated TV show.
Oh, okay. It's like, wow, look at Leslie's room.
I just had a class that ended at 5:40, so I wanted to take a few bites of food without.
Oh, okay. You don't want to munch in front of us. I get it. I did the same thing in my
lab. You
last.
guys gonna watch me.
Okay. What do you have? Some TP floating behind you, or what is that? What is that?
It's right over like the heavenly lens flare of what would be the benevolent, but it's Angel Soft Ultra.
Angel Soft. All right.
I made it special for class.
Yeah, I think you forgot the hand sanitizer on the other side.
So if there are no questions on previous material that you're still not sure of, then we're going to launch into the box model.
You did say, John?
Yes.
Exercise 9 is going to become next class's material?
The opposite. Exercise 10 is going to become the next exercise. What's listed as exercise 9, I'm going to pull off because we've already done some of it in the previous exercise. I've been rearranging stuff.
So we're yanking 9. Got it.
Yes. So in other words, don't work ahead to the next exercise after the one we're covering today. And if you want to work ahead, look at exercise 10, which will be exercise 9. Or I will make a new exercise 9 and leave that as exercise 10. But in other words, the current exercise 9, ignore that.
Got it.
Because we've already done some of that in a previous exercise. I've been rearranging stuff.
Brilliant.
Thank you for that. Okay, so let's talk about the CSS box model. And by the way, I just downloaded a new text editor because I don't know if you remember last week when I was using Text Wrangler, if I tried to change the font size, it would crash while I was sharing my screen. It doesn't crash any other time, only when I'm sharing my screen with Zoom, which of course I found out when we were doing it last week. So this time I just have brackets. It's a different text editor, so hopefully there won't be any problems like there were last week with it crashing. And I've already set the font size up. So I am going to share my screen. And you should see it momentarily. Do you see that? Are you folks seeing my screen? Anybody? Yes, I see a nod.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Okay, so let's move that out of the way for a minute. Let's start with the box model. All right, so the box model is a basic building block of positioning. And basically, there's what you call the content, which would be, for example, an image or a paragraph or any HTML content. And you can think of these concentric boxes. I don't know if that's the word. You would say concentric circles. What would be the term for? Would you say concentric boxes? Boxes around the boxes. So you have the content box, and then you have padding around that, and you have border around that, and then you have the margin around that. And the content, let's say the content was a paragraph. Well, when you specify the height and width of that paragraph, well, let's say the content was an image. When you specify the height and width of the image, it only includes the content, the image itself, for example. The padding around it, the border and the margin would not be part of the height and width. They would be outside of that, okay? So if your picture was, 100 by 200 pixels, the content would be 100 by 200. And so if you're looking at this height and width, that's what we're talking about here. Now, you don't have to have paddings, borders, or margins. They can all go away, but you have to realize that the browser has default settings for some of these things. And so if the browser didn't have some default paddings or margins, for example, everything on the page would touch each other, right? Everything would touch the thing around it. So when you have a headline and then you put a paragraph under it, there's a lot of space between the headline and the paragraph, right? You didn't put that space there, right? It's because the browser has default margin settings, for example. Okay, so once, of course, you set a margin or a border or a padding, you overrule the default settings in your browser. So a lot of times, if you're, have I talked about reset style sheets in here yet?
No.
Okay, there's the concept of what's called a reset style sheet. And essentially, that's a style sheet that sets everything to the blandest, most vanilla settings possible. And generally, that means everything is zeroed out. So there's no paddings, there's no borders, there's no margins. Everything's the same size, everything is flush left, and so a reset style sheet is used to basically blow out all the browser defaults. So you're basically starting with a clean slate. And then you put in your styles. Many times if you download a template, a framework, any kind of style sheet system, one of the things you'll see is a reset style sheet built into the default style sheet, because resetting everything to 0 allows you to start really cleanly so that you're not depending on browser defaults that you're sometimes unconsciously aware of, But outside of a reset style sheet, all those styles are in there from the browser, and once you start setting the box model properties, you will overrule them. Just like setting any style sheet will overrule the browser once you conflict with it. So we got some new people here. All right. So this little thing called the CSS box model is in my tutorials called box model. And it outlines how the box model works. So we're going to start by looking at the box model. The padding is space around the content, and again, the content could be any HTML tag, for example. And the padding is between the border and the content. So if you put a border, let's say your content's an image, and if you want to put a border around the image, if you make the padding go away, make it equal to 0, then the border will touch the image. It'll be around the outside of the image. But you might want a little error between the image and a border around it, in which case you would put a little padding in there. The margin is always transparent. It's always invisible. So you can't really see it, except you can ascertain where it is by looking at the behavior of the objects on the page and seeing how close they get to each other. You can also just reset the margin to see where it is. The content area, we'll go down this list. Content area is, again, could be any HTML element, and let's say it's a paragraph. If you give a background color to the content, it not only shows through the content, let's say that paragraph, and you give it a background color of yellow, not only will the yellow show through the paragraph, it will extend up to the border. So one way to see the padding is to give the object, the content, a background color. Then you can actually see where the background color ends is where the padding ends. Or actually, more specifically, it's where the border ends. Because the background also applies to the border, but you don't see that because the border itself is visible, and then you don't see the background color in front of the border because it would show behind the border. Now, padding cannot be a negative value. That sounds like logical. Margins can be negative. That's why we're making the distinction here. But paddings can be 0 or some other value, but they cannot be negative. And the more padding you have, the more space you have around the object or the content object. Padding, as I said before, takes the background of the content. So if you give the content a background color or image, it will also show through the padding. The border can also not be a negative value. That wouldn't really make sense. Borders have their own set style list. There's a CSS property called border-style. And you can set borders to be solid lines, dotted lines, dashes, dots, double lines, grooved lines, and so forth. So there's a property called border-style where you can say solid, which would just be a line. Or you could say double, which would be 2 lines. Or you could say border-style : dashed, which would be dashed. And it would actually look like this dashed line here. But so the borders have a lot of styles that you can play with. You can also set the border color. If you don't set a border color by default, what color do you think it takes? Anybody?
Black.
Let's say I have, what'd you say, Josh? Gabe?
Black.
Black. Well, not necessarily.
Then
It might.
transparent. It's transparent.
No, it takes the default color of the content.
Oh.
So if your content was a paragraph and the text was black, yes, then the border would be black. But if your content was red, then the border would be red by
That was my
default.
third guess.
Yeah, by default. Good one. So whatever, let's say you've got your content container, a paragraph or a headline or a list or item or something like that. Whatever color that text is, that would be the default color of the border should you choose to put a border around that object. You can change that with the border-color property and set the border color to be anything you want. But by default, if you don't set the border-color property, it will take the color of the content itself. Okay. Let's see, margins. Margins are the fun ones. Margins, remember margin here. Margins are transparent always. Margins can be a negative value. Now, what does that mean? If you have a margin and you give it a very large value, it makes a lot of space around the object. So if you had 2 paragraphs, one stacked on top of the other, and each paragraph had a margin around it, then there would be space between the paragraphs. But if you gave a paragraph a negative margin, that paragraph would move closer to the other paragraph. In fact, you can make the negative margin so great that it moves an object to overlap an object next to it. So negative margins are an interesting technique to move things around. It's not uncommon to use negative margins when you want to really do something interesting. Margins can be set to auto. And a margin set to auto is the standard way to center horizontally a block level object, block level element. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, there are shorthand properties to all these things. So I'm going to start with the longhand properties. Here's an example of a style sheet with, and how many rules is in this style sheet? Anybody? How many rules? Unmute yourself if you're muted. How many rules are in this style sheet? It's a very simple question.
Like about 13?
Nope. Good guess.
15?
One.
Nope. Who said one?
Oh, one.
One. Oh, I
One.
see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
One. It has one selector,
Yeah.
right, which is the paragraph, and then it has an open curly brace. There's its closed curly brace, and all these are properties with values separated by semicolons, but it's only one selector. It's only one rule. If you only see one set of angle brackets, it's one rule. Count the angle bracket sets. Each angle bracket set, which includes the properties and values, indicates a rule. Or the selector, one selector indicates a rule. Now the selector could be complex, so that could get a little complicated. But the angle brackets are very straightforward. So if you see one set of angle brackets, that's one rule. If you see two sets of angle brackets, that's two rules, right? So this style sheet only has one rule, but it has lots of declarations, right? So note that in this style sheet, there are separate settings for paddings, top, right, bottom, and left. Separate borders for top, right, bottom, and left. Separate margins for top, right, bottom, and left. So what that tells you is that top, right, bottom, and left can be set independently if you wish. So then you can put more space around the top of an object than the bottom of an object, or more space around the left side than the right side, or whatever. Now, this is longhand, so we're gonna start with longhand properties. Padding dash top, padding dash right, padding dash bottom, padding dash left are all set to 0. So you could say there's 0 padding. And if you look at the result, which is down here, this is the paragraph, the 0 padding, 0 border, 0 margin, and a background color of yellow. Now, why does the yellow color extend all the way to the right? I've covered this before. Who remembers?
Margin is 0.
The margin is 0, but that's not the answer.
Is it the default?
The body.
Well, you're getting close. Remember, a paragraph is a block level element. What is the default width of any block level element?
The body?
Could be if the element was directly inside the body. That's your major hint to the answer to the question. Oh, great. Okay. Sorry, I can't really. Let me just.
It's a robocall. You better get it.
It's the president.
Yeah, this is an antiquated phone machine. Thank you. So I can't really.
Yeah, hi, John. This is Corbett Wright. I sent you an email. I wanted to make sure that you got it. My cell phone is 408-205.
Sorry about that. We're just gonna. I'm just gonna have to let that go because he's leaving a number. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little louder so that talks over him. Yeah, I gotta remember to disconnect the phone next time before I start one of these Zoom lectures. All right, I'm gonna just have to.
They do food pantry, etc. Anyway.
Hopefully that'll work. Let's try something. Hey, we won't have any more interruptions. Sorry about that. So the default width of any block level element is the width of its parent element. So if that element is in the body, then the body is the default width. And so you can only really see the width of something sometimes, in this case, by putting a background color on it, because the background, as we know, extends all the way through the padding, right? So the background extends from the content to the padding to the border. And now we can clearly see that the width of this paragraph is wider than you see. So that's just a reminder. Now, here's another question. You see that the color is yellow, the background. Now, how far does it extend? It depends, in this case, on the font. It will extend as high as the tallest font, the tallest character in that font, and extend as low as the lowest character's descender, and so forth. Now, if I add padding to it, that field of yellow will get bigger. But because there's 0 padding on the paragraph, it's showing you the exact dimensions of the paragraph and nothing more and nothing less. Because the border is also set to 0, you don't see a border because there is none. And the margin is set to 0 and the margin is visible, so you don't see that anyway. And the background color, of course, is yellow. So that's an explanation of what we're looking at here. But here's the deal. See padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. There's a pattern here. Top, right, bottom, left. Top, right, bottom, left. So top, right, bottom, left is an important order of something you want to memorize. You can think of it like T, R, B, L, which trouble is the way I remember it. T, R, B, L. You can think about like a clock, 12, 3, 6, and 9. But that order is important because for the shorthand properties, you're going to use that. And I'll show you what I mean. If we scroll down further, we see this style sheet is equivalent to this style sheet above it. These two style sheets are the same thing. This style sheet that's highlighted above is longhand properties. This style sheet below is the same thing. It's calling out the exact same styles with shorthand properties. So when you see padding colon 0000, separated by spaces, not commas, border width 0000, margin 0000, what that's shorthand for is top is 0, right is 0, bottom is 0, left is 0, TRBL, trouble. And if I change one of these numbers, then that dimension would change. The first one's top, second one's right, third one's bottom, fourth one is left. So TRBL, trouble, top, right, bottom, left, that's the order, always. And so it's a very handy to set things like that with the 4 numbers. Now, by the way, you see 0 and no unit of measurement after it because I don't need to say 0 pixels or 0 inches or 0% or 0 m's or 0 anything because 0 is 0. So 0 inches is the same thing as 0 millimeters, which is the same as 0 whatever. So if you had a number other than 0, you would have to say a unit of measurement after it, like 5 px, right? 5 pixels. But 0, I could say 0 px after each one of these zeros, but it's not necessary because 0 itself is the only numerical value that does not require a unit of measurement. Does that make sense?
Quick question, John.
Yeah.
So if you were using the shorthand properties for, say, padding, and you had a 0, and then the next, so the top was 0, but the right was 5, then the 5 would have to have a value.
Yes, so it could be like 0, 5 px, 0, 0.
But you don't need anything between those. You don't need a semicolon.
No, you don't. You don't use, no, this is all one declaration.
Got it.
So
Okay.
you only separate the 4 values by spaces.
Got it.
So that's how the syntax works with this.
Follow up to that.
Pardon?
Can I follow up to that?
Sure.
If you want to put a different unit of measurement in there, like inches or whatever, are there X amount of designated recognized units of measurement you can use instead?
Yes,
of
there are. In the same way that there are designated ways to say color values, there are designated units of length measurement. So off the top of my head, the most common would be px or pixels, right? You could use IN for inches. You could use mm for millimeters. You could use percent for percent, the percent sign. Percent is always of the parent object, by the way. So if you said, you know, this image is 60% wide, it's 60% the width of whatever container it's in.
Cool.
Percent is interesting. It also compounds. So if you have percents of percents, it gets logarithmic. It's really weird. Percents are tricky. Everything else is fairly straightforward. You can use points, PT. You generally only use a point specification in your print style sheet. When you're sending something to a printer, you generally don't use points when you're specifying stuff for screen media. We'll get into that later when we talk about different kinds of media style sheets. But pixels and ems are probably the two standard, ems, em, which is a relative unit of measurement. Pixels, of course, sounds like an absolute unit of measurement. It's actually a relative unit of measurement because pixels are not all the same size on different screens. So you can think of pixels as an absolute unit of measurement, but it's actually a relative unit of measurement. But pixels and ems are probably the standard way you do most things. If it's a print style sheet, because it's going to specify how something should look when it's printed, you probably use points or inches or something like that, like a more of a fixed thing that makes sense for paper. And units of measurement have to follow the number with no space. So if I said 5px, it would be 5px, not 5 space px. The spaces are what you put between the top, right, bottom, and left. So good so far? All right. Now, I mentioned that okay, all these style sheets here are the same. That's super longhand. That is somewhat shorthand for the same thing above it. This is super shorthand. It's the same as this and the one above it. So if the 4 values are the same, you abbreviate by just saying one value. 0 means all the top, right, bottom, left are 0. The borders of 0, the width of the top, right, bottom, and left border are 0, and so forth, right? So this is super shorthand. And if the amount of space you want to put around something in terms of padding or margin, or the thickness of the border is the same around all 4 sides, you can just use one number. I could say 0 or 5px, done. And that means the border would be that width on top, right, bottom, and left. So if that's super longhand there, moderately shorthand, super shorthand. They're all the same style sheet. Personally, I find myself using this kind of system most of the time with the 4 numbers. Frequently, the top, right, bottom, left are not going to be the same. And it's just easy to visualize and pretty quick to write. So I generally go this middle route, but if the numbers are all the same, you say one number, you're done. Okay. So those 3 style sheets, longhand, shorthand, super shorthand. Question?
I was going to say for example, for like if, let's just say we're working on a website that's constantly being updated, would it be better to work with the one with the 4 numbers or the one with the single, like?
Personal preference.
Okay.
Personal preference. Now, this last example is a little different than the others, and this kind of combines some of the things we were just talking about. So this might make it a little more clear. The result of this style sheet is this paragraph down here. So this is different than the other 3. So here's a paragraph, and now we're saying padding 0, 5px, 10px, 15px. So top, right, bottom, left. 0 padding on the top. There's 0 space between this top line of text and the border. 0 space there. 5 pixels on the right. Now, because it's a ragged right, you can't see exactly 5 pixels because it's not a justified paragraph. 10 pixels bottom. So between this text and this border on the bottom, 10 pixels. And 15 pixels on the right. So between this border, this double red border, and the text on the left, that's 15 pixels right there. Okay. Now, here we see 2 values for border. We see border style and border width. Now, in the other examples, when I said border 0, That's really shorthand for border dash width, okay? So when I say border 0 or border width 0, 0, 0, 0, that's the same thing, because border is the shorthand property for border width, border style. So let me talk about border style. Border style is an important property, and there are different values: solid, dotted, dashed, double. There's some of the standard values. There's more than that. Solid is top, right? Top, right, bottom, left. Solid, dotted, dashed, double. Top, solid. It's a solid line at the top, the border at the top. The border to the right is dotted. The border on the bottom is dashed. And the border to the left is double. And by the way, if you specify a double border and you only give it a width of 1 or 2 pixels, that's not going to work, because it needs to have at minimum 2 lines and a space between them to see a double border. So if you specify a double border, you better give it a width of a minimum of 3 pixels, or you're kind of like giving the browser kind of crappy instructions. It won't understand what you want to do. And in this case, border width top is 1 px. That's a simple line, simple line. Border to the right, 5 px. Border to the bottom, 10 px. That's the border width. And the border to the left, 15. So that the 2 red bars and the space between them is 15 pixels wide. So you see how this top, right, bottom, left works? I find it very, after a while, you just visualize it like, you know, top, right, bottom, left. It'll become second nature. Here, because I wanted to set the border left different in terms of color, I used the border dash left dash color property. Okay. Now you could also use shorthand border property and say color, but before you get into using a lot of shorthand properties, it's good to understand the longhand properties. So border's weird because you say border left color, and that would be red, and that's why this double border here is red, because its style is double and its width is 15 and its color is red. So you see how you can set the different aspects of the box model properties in terms of top, right, bottom, and left. They can be set the same or independently of each other. And again, the background color is yellow. Now, by the way, the background color of yellow, I said before that the background color, the padding takes the background color of the content, but the border also takes the background color of the content. And if it was a solid line border, you wouldn't notice that there's yellow behind it. But if your border style has gaps in it, like it's dotted or dashed or doubled, then you will see the color, the background color of the object showing through the border even. So when you give an element a background color, that background color is taken by both the content, I mean, not only the content, but both the border, the padding and the border. And you only see that with a border that has gaps in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know that that yellow actually technically extends under the border. Okay. So this is the basic box model. So far, so good? Questions? Any questions? Remember to mute yourself if you have a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say the content takes on, excuse me, takes on the color, what kind of content? I mean, an image seems like it wouldn't have transparency. So we're talking about if an image had transparency. I guess I just answered my own question.
Well, yeah, obviously, if you have an opaque object, let's say it's an image that's not a transparent GIF, it's just a JPEG or something, there's no transparency in it, and you give it a background color, well, you're not going to see the background color because it's behind an opaque object. But if that was a GIF that had transparency or a ping that had transparency, and you gave that image a background color, it would show through the transparent parts of the image. Just
so that's
as,
pretty much the only.
Pardon?
The only situation then? I mean.
Well, no, you're looking at one right now. Here's a paragraph. You're seeing the background color showing through the paragraph.
Oh.
The yellow is behind the paragraph, right?
Right. Okay.
But if the paragraph, if it was an image instead of a paragraph that I gave the background color to, and the image was opaque, you wouldn't see the background color.
Right, but that, yeah, I understand why that.
There's actually a very minor exception to that, but it has to do with line height and descenders of text, and we'll get into that later.
I wasn't trying to go that way. And oh, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the box model in a nutshell.
I have a quick
Okay.
question, John.
Yeah.
Are there standards, or I'm thinking of maybe specifically of paragraphs on a web page.
Mhm.
You know, are there some standard maybe percentage things that people use so that things look good on the screen? I realize with mobile devices, you know, you're probably dealing in percentages, but I just wondered if there's sort of a not a default. Well, it could be a default, but kind of, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. And what you're asking about, you're basically asking about principles of typography.
Mm-hmm.
And so principles of typography are essentially the same for print and web. I mean, the web is primarily a visual medium. Just print is primarily a visual medium. I mean, it has tactileness. You can touch it and smell it and so forth. I love smelling things back from the printer. But it's primarily a visual medium. And so is the web, primarily a visual medium. So in a visual medium, you do have principles of graphic design and typography that make sense. And essentially, they're the same principles. Now, you adapt them to different media. So it's not exactly the same, but the principles of what looks good in terms of the size of the font and how much space between the lines in terms of your leading, indentations, margins, how to format paragraphs. I mean, the same principles apply. It's the same typographic principles that apply here as well. So in that sense, yes, there are good standards of typography. There are some pretty exacting standards of typography, depending on who you read. Like, you should have, this much leading for this size font. If the column width is this, if it's a magazine article, a newspaper article, or a book, there's some different kinds of standards. So the short answer is yes. There are some standards. And Leslie could probably tell you a lot more about those, right, Leslie?
Yes, I'd be delighted. You
And
don't want to give up another 2 hours, though.
Exactly. And in my Web Publishing 2 class, which unfortunately isn't really going to be taught anymore, which is essentially graphics in the web, we do a whole many hours on web typography. We do a whole 3-hour module just on web typography, which unfortunately I can't really include here, but I can get to some of that after we get through the 10 exercises. Because that's one of the longer exercises that I use in my other classes. So I can shorthand that for you. But yeah, the short answer is yes, there are. Web typography is very similar to print typography because the visual principles are the same, but the medium does require some differences, and because you can flow the text in different ways, and it's not exactly the same as print. But visual design principles are visual design principles. So what looks good to the eye is pretty similar print and web. You get much higher resolution in print, so that's one of the limitations of web. And that affects some of your decisions, especially with font sizes and whether you're using serif fonts and so forth. Because on the web you just don't have the clarity that you have in print. Although that is changing rapidly, and monitor technology is getting denser and denser with the pixels. And at some point the monitor resolutions are going to be more than a few hundred pixels an inch. Some of the better technologies now are several hundred pixels per inch. And as that increases, the crispness of the screen technology, when that approaches something like print, then there'll be less differences, fewer differences between some of the principles used in print and web. So the differences in the graphic design principle in print and web have to do with the fact that the web is dynamic and the pages can change size and everything. So that creates a whole new dynamic. As well as the clarity of the monitor, especially when you talk about small font sizes. So you have considerations there for accessibility and so forth that are maybe a little different than print. Is that helpful? Sorry, long answer to a short question. If there's no further questions on the box model, and if you have any, ask them now, I'm going to move on to floats. All right. So now I'm going to move to floats, and we are going to take a break at 7, by the way. So that's in about 14 minutes. I got a timer set. So when that timer goes off, it'll be time for a break because I tend to just keep talking, and I will stop myself. But we're going to start on floats before the break. So floats, a float is a way to make text flow around an object. So what do you call that in InDesign, Leslie? I do this all the time. What is it called? Can't remember.
What are you asking again?
Well, what we call a float in the web is flowing text around an object. What do you call that in InDesign? There's
Text wrap.
Text wrap, exactly. So if you're a print person and you're familiar with the concept of text wrap, that's kind of the effect you achieve with what's called a float. So if you float an image, the text will wrap around it. Okay. So I've got a few pages ready here. Box model and floats. Let me make this. So that's the exercise we'll be looking at. Box model and floats. Float. Okay, that's its values. Clear. I want. That's my start. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I just want to use, this is a CSS positioning tutorial on brainjar.com. It's a really oldie. I've used this for years. We're not going to get into relative positioning today, but I want to look at the floats part of it right here. So here's an example of a float. This guy here is floating inside this guy here. And we see here from the code, we have a paragraph, that's the big box, and we have a span, that's this little box. The span is floating inside the paragraph with a float right value, which means it floats to the right. If this said float left, this little box here would be on the left, and the text would flow around it on the right-hand side. But if you float this thing to the right, the text flows around it on the left. So this is an example of a float. Now, the CSS style is, the property is simply float. Float can take a value of left or right. There is no center, okay? There is no center. Everybody wants to try it. It doesn't work. You can only float to the left or the right, okay?
That was frustrating for me, man.
Oh, did you try that? Not gonna work.
I was chasing my tail around.
And as it says right here, the flow property can be one of left, right, none, or inherit, and you basically almost never use none or inherit. It's always left or right. The only reason you would even use none is to try to overrule something previously specified, and that's not going to happen. And inherit, that gets messy because you would inherit, when you inherit something, you're getting the property from the parent element, and it's just not necessary to go there. It's very confusing. So you're really just going to use left and right. Okay, you're going to float to the left and float to the right. And the float applies to the object that's inside the other object. Okay, so again, concentric boxes. So let's break this down a little more. This is a local style. You remember that? Style equals. It's a local style. Just for the purpose of this example, they wanted to make it simple. So float is the property, and then right is the value. But then we're also adding another property of width and 40%. Remember, this applies to the span. The span is this inner box that has the 4 content words in it, right? So we're floating the span in the paragraph, and we're giving the span a width of 40%. So whenever you use percent, and I said this earlier, whenever you use percents, that begs the question, percent of what? And what is the answer here? 40% of what? Who's paying attention?
Element or the parent?
The parent element. And what's the parent element of the span, which is taking the width of 40%?
Your paragraph.
Exactly. So whatever the width of the paragraph is, that could be fixed or variable depending on how the page is set up. The span will always be 40% of that width. And you can see that that looks about 40%. Now, 40% of this white box, because that's the content. This gray box indicates padding. It's not specified here, but that's what it's visually showing. And this white box around it indicates a margin. Okay. Oh, that's a fixed width page, so that's not going to help. Okay. So why is it necessary? This is a good, think about this for a second, because this puts together a few things we just talked about today. Why is it necessary to specify the width on a span that is floating inside a paragraph? What would happen here? Let me flip the question around. What would happen if we didn't have width 40% and we just had float right?
It would fill the whole paragraph.
Well, depending on whether the object that's floating, yeah, you're kind of there. Depending on whether the object that's floating is an inline level or block level element, the rules are a little different for how widths work. And as you remember, the default width of a block level element is the width of its parent element. So let's say that span was a block, that wasn't a span, it was a block level element of some kind. It would go as wide as it could, and you wouldn't see the float effect. It would be like a stacking effect, depending on what the content was. So if that doesn't make sense to you, then write this one down. Always specify the width of something that is floating. Always specify the width of a float. So if you're going to apply float right or float left to some object, you also want to apply a width to the object. Because if you don't, you may not get the effect you wish to achieve. Now, if it's an image that's floating, and frequently it is an image, the image does have an inherent natural width. That's the size of the actual image. So the exception to what I just said is, if it's something that has an inherent width, and that's going to be an image, then it's not necessarily important to specify the width, because it has an inherent width. It has a natural width in pixels. And that, unless you change that, that's what the image width will be, and it won't expand or contract. It will just be its natural width unless you specify otherwise. And so in that case, it's not necessary to specify width unless, of course, you want to change it from its inherent or natural width. But other than that, something that doesn't have an inherent width, like a span or a paragraph or a div or whatever, that thing is going to have variable width depending on how many words are in it and how wide it can go and so forth. So in that case, you want to always specify a width. So the bottom line is, when you float something, you also specify its width. When you float something, you also specify its width. Easy thing to forget, and then you're on, how come my work isn't looking right? My float's not working, it's broken. Did you specify a width? Oh, I forgot. There you go. That's what generally the first mistake is when you start doing this. Okay, now, the next page here shows an example of what happens when you try to float something that's too big. Here's an example where we have 3 objects. We have the top one, the bottom one, and this one on the right. That's a float, but it's inside this top box, but it doesn't fit in the top box. So if you try to float a large thing in a small thing, it has to bust out, okay, by default. So here's this code for this. So here we have this first paragraph is this top one. The span is floating inside the first paragraph, and here's the span. And the second paragraph is this bottom paragraph. So if the contents of the float won't fit in the box you're floating it inside of, it'll bust out. Not only will it bust out, it will then affect the flow of the following box, as you can see here. Now, usually when you see that, it's a mistake because you didn't realize that you're floating a big thing inside a little thing. Sometimes you do this intentionally for effect, but usually when you see this, it's a mistake. The reason this can occur sometimes is because text can change size. The user can bump up a text size when viewing a page that can actually break your really nice layout. Again, one of the basic differences between web and print design. The user can screw you up. The user can say, I want to see my text really big, and then the perfectly crafted layout that you were looking at, you know, in 12 pixel type, you know, in 36 pixel type, it's all broken, right? So the user can break you there. So you have to understand what happens if the contents of the floating box is bigger than the contents of the box it's floating inside of. And this is one possible effect of that problem. Now, there's a way to remedy that with what's called a clear. And a clear is what happens here. So if you put a clear on the thing that's being on the thing that's following the float, what the clear says is nothing can be next to me. So there's a clear on this third box down here. Here there's no clear. So if you try to float a big thing and a little thing, it busts out and messes up the way the next thing flows on the page. But if you put a clear on the following object, then you can't stop the float from busting out, but it will then push down the next box rather than flow in, and rather than disturb it like this. You see the difference? So that is called using a clear. Now the clear is applied to the thing that follows the parent of the float. You don't clear the float, you clear the thing that follows the parent of the float. So here we have, this is familiar, the float, right, 40% inside this paragraph. But the paragraph is really small compared to the contents of the span, which is really big, so you get this behavior. But when you put a clear on the following paragraph, so the clear is on this guy, you put a clear on that, you're basically saying, here, nothing can be to the right of me if it's a clear right. If I said clear left, nothing would be to the left of this. Clear both would mean nothing can be next to me at all. Now this says clear right because this is a float right. So if you're following a float right, you would generally say a clear right. If it's a float left, you would say clear left. If you say clear both, your bases are covered. And that's the easy thing to do without having to think about it. Gary, question.
Can you define the height to be a percentage? So in addition to your clear, you're always getting your float inside your intended paragraph, regardless of user.
Wow, that simple question is actually tricky. Heights are squirrely and tricky. Widths are generally what you specify. It is fairly rare to specify heights actually in most of web design because it doesn't work the way you think it would work. The browsers kind of get squirrely. Heights are trickier than widths. And so if you find yourself specifying heights of things, and they're not like fixed things like images, but you're talking about now paragraphs and stuff, you have to do a lot of testing in a couple of browsers to make sure you're getting the behavior you want. Let me just say for now that heights are tricky and they're squirrely, and you don't always get the behavior. You can try it, but there are a lot of contextual things here that come into play, and it's more complex. So without getting into too much detail, let's just say play with it if you want, but realize it might not always work the way you want it to.
Got it.
I'll stop there for now. But you are mostly, that's why in CSS we mostly specify widths. The other thing, oh, it's time for a break. Snooze. The other thing is that generally speaking, you want to avoid what's called over-constraining. For example, if you specify the height and width of, let's say, a paragraph, you are over-constraining if the text size can be changed. So if you specify the height and width of a paragraph, and then the user says, oh, I'm going to raise my text size, I can't read that. Some millennial wrote that text, and I can't read 8-point text on the screen or whatever, and they bump it up. Now what happens to your box that you've specified the height and width, but now the text is growing larger than will fit in what you specified? Something has to break. So generally you specify widths and not heights, and the heights are where you allow that extra flow to happen when things change size. That's
cool.
A general principle in the web. Good question. But I'm going to stop it there because we're going to take our 10-minute break. So it's 7:01. Let's come back in 11 minutes and we'll pick up here. And then you can ask more questions or we can move on. Okay?
Right
Very
on.
good then. So, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oops, no, not new share. Stop share. Oh, now I've done it.
Did you stop your recording?
And I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, we'll see you guys after the break.